You know, when you look at the ruins of these incredible ancient places, the stone cities of the Maya, the sprawling Roman Empire, you can't help but wonder, right? How could something so huge, so powerful, just fall apart? For centuries, it's been one of history's absolute greatest mysteries.
So yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Why? What causes these massive, complex societies to fail? Is there some kind of pattern we can pull from all that rubble? Well, it turns out modern science is starting to give us some really clear and honestly, kind of unsettling answers.
Okay, so for the longest time, we had this movie-like idea of what collapse looks like. You know, a barbarian horde smashing down the gates, or a giant supervolcano blotting out the sun. Some single, dramatic event. But the science, it tells a totally different story. Collapse is almost never a sudden knockout punch. It's way more like a long, slow illness. A systemic failure where a society just gradually loses its ability to solve its own problems.
And when scientists talk about collapse, they mean something really specific. It's not like everyone just vanishes overnight. Nope, it's that the complexity of the society disappears. All those intricate systems that hold everything together, the government, the trade networks, the culture itself, they just break down. Society gets simpler, it gets more scattered, and yeah, often a lot more violent.
So you might be wondering, how in the world do we know all this? I mean, how can you possibly diagnose what went wrong with a society that died out thousands of years ago? Well, it's because we've basically developed this incredible kind of historical forensics. Think of it like CSI for ancient worlds. And it's giving us actual hard data from the deep past.
And the toolkit we have now is just, wow, it's incredible. By drilling into ancient lake beds and ice cores, scientists can literally reconstruct the weather year by year for thousands of years. We can analyze the chemistry of a single human bone and tell what that person ate, whether they were starving, and even where they grew up. This isn't guesswork, you guys. This is hard data.
And this data lets us build a really clear case. Let's take the Indus Valley Civilization, one of the world's very first great urban societies. Using that climate data, scientists built this exact timeline. It shows how, at first, they were adapting to changing rainfall by moving closer to the river, which is a huge red flag, right? A clear sign of environmental stress. But then, something happens that they just can't adapt to. And here it is, the final blow. A catastrophic drought that lasted for 113 years. I mean, think about that. That's not a bad summer. That is generations of people living under this relentless pressure. And the most crucial part, this exact time period lines up perfectly with the archaeological evidence for when their great cities were abandoned. The timing is just, it's undeniable.
But here's the really important question. Was it just the drought, or was that drought simply the final straw that broke the camel's back for a society that was already in trouble? And this brings us to the core theory of how collapse really works.
It's a concept called complexity overhang. And the idea is pretty simple, actually. As societies get bigger and more successful, they add more and more layers of complexity. Bigger armies, more bureaucrats, vast infrastructure projects. At first, all this stuff helps solve problems. But over time, the cost and the sheer energy needed just to maintain all that complexity becomes this crushing burden. It makes the whole system fragile.
The best way to think about it is like a game of Jenga. Every new block you add, a new law, a new government agency, another province to defend, it makes the tower taller, sure, but it also makes it way more unstable. And eventually, the whole structure gets so wobbly that even a tiny little bump can bring the entire thing crashing down.
And that little bump? That's what scientists call an acute shock. That's the headline-grabbing event, like that 113-year drought. But the real danger, the thing that made the tower wobbly in the first place, are the chronic stressors. These are the slow-burn problems that have been weakening the society for decades, maybe even centuries. Stuff like slowly degrading soil, running out of key resources, or just corrupt institutions. The kind of problems that are really easy to ignore until it's way too late.
So here's the most important part. The acute shock and the chronic stressors, they work together. It's a deadly combination. The slow burn problems eat away at a society's resilience, its ability to bounce back from a crisis. They weaken the foundations. So then, when that inevitable shock finally hits, the system is just too fragile to handle it, and it shatters.
All right, so let's take this whole framework and apply it back to our case file on the Indus Valley. Let's see how this dynamic actually played out for them, step by step. This is basically the fatal chain reaction. The drought, that was the trigger. That forced this massive migration of people toward the last reliable water source, the river.
But that response, their solution, actually created new and even worse problems. We're talking massive overcrowding, intense competition for resources, and a total social breakdown. And we know this because when we look at the skeletons from this exact period, we see this huge spike in evidence for violence and horrible diseases like leprosy. It was a cascading failure. Each problem just made the next one worse until the whole system just broke apart.
And look, this isn't just a good story. This conclusion is built on converging lines of hard evidence. Climate science told us when the stress hit. Archaeology showed us where people moved in response. And bioarchaeology, the study of the human remains themselves, showed us the grim biological consequences of that stress. All the pieces fit together. So the Indus Valley isn't just some unique one-off story. By looking at multiple collapses across history, we can start to see history as this giant laboratory, running these incredible experiments on how complex societies either succeed or fail.
And when we do that, a really clear pattern starts to emerge. Look at this. For the Maya, yeah, drought was the trigger, but they had already weakened their environment through massive deforestation. For Rome, pandemics and migrations were the big shocks, but the empire was already groaning under the weight of its own immense complexity. The details are different, for sure, but the basic formula, a vulnerable system getting hit by a major shock, is remarkably, and I mean remarkably, consistent.
And this brings us to what is probably the single most important takeaway from all of this research. The final shock, the drought, the pandemic, the invasion, it isn't the cause of the collapse, it's the trigger. The real cause is the pre-existing fragility that was built up over centuries. It's the loss of resilience that left the society with no good options when a crisis finally struck.
But, and this is important, there's a hopeful note here. Collapse is not inevitable. As this quote gets at, some societies do survive these crises. And the ones that make it, they're the ones that are able to adapt, the ones that can buffer the shock and reorganize themselves to meet the challenge. Resilience, not just raw strength, is the real key to long-term survival.
And this, of course, brings the question right back to us, doesn't it? We are living in, without a doubt, the most complex civilization in human history. And we are facing our own unique set of chronic stressors and, let's be honest, the potential for some pretty major acute shocks. So, if history really is a laboratory, what are its experiments telling us about our own resilience today? That's a question worth thinking about.